Welcome to the John Cady Podcast. I'm John Cady, U.S. Navy retired, former minister. Picking up from the previous episode where I talked about what it was like to leave a high-control, high-performance ministry that placed a lot of unnecessary restrictions on people. In this episode, I'm going to focus on, one, the decision to leave and the aftermath that follows. A lot of people who have been in abusive churches find themselves in that position where, yes, I know that something's wrong and it's not adding up to Scripture. I know that God doesn't teach what is being taught from that pulpit. I want to leave, but I don't know how, and I don't know what the consequences are going to be. I don't know if I'm going to end up losing more than gaining. And that's a valid argument. And I mean, it's a very valid argument. When I began to realize just how corrupt my former church was, the one where I held license, the process between realizing this and finally walking out the door took a little over a year. And it wasn't easy. And I knew that there was a price to pay. There was definitely a price to pay and a risk to take when I drafted that reform proposal. I even told one of the guys on the ship that I knew that if I sent that in, I ran the risk of being kicked out of the church, but it was a risk I had to take because I got tired of all the stories being told of the misconduct of the founder and why he actually went to prison. It was for crimes against minors. On March 19th, 2003, there was a church meeting. I was required to wait until the pastor walked in because he wanted to give this appearance that all the single men in the church were in unity with him, so we all marched in behind him. But at that point, my breaking point was already there. It came down to where we were told that if we were to vote yes to have him as our pastor, that we were going to have to accept everything else that came along with it. At that moment, I had enough. And when the 3x5 cards were handed out, in a very difficult but very decisive moment, I did write the word no. I was tired of it. I didn't want this anymore. But what I didn't expect was what would happen next. And it happened quickly. Almost immediately. Nobody called. Nobody called me. Nobody asked me, how I was doing. Nobody asked me why I voted no. It was over. I was completely cut off. Invitations to come back out for the services, there were none. Any concern that might have been involved went to silence. And I'm pretty sure that there was a narrative that circulated that I was now an enemy of the ministry, an enemy of the gospel, that I have joined all those who wish to do the church harm, all of that I was bitter, that I was angry, I was rebellious. Of course, there was never a real formal policy. It was just something that was passed on from the pulpit to the people in the church. And the cultural enforcement was what actually was happening. There was briefly a guy who stayed with me at the apartment because I had to switch apartments due to the one I was normally in had to be repaired. But they very quickly moved him out because they were afraid that anything about me that made me want to leave was going to rub off on him, and they wanted none of that to happen. And that ties into the next part, the fear of contamination. Fear of questioning. They were afraid that this other friend would start asking questions. Well, John, why did you leave? I always knew you to be solid. You had to have seen something that made you change your mind. And sometimes it's fear of leadership response. The worst thing that some of these guys could deal with would be a flat rebuke from the pastor and being threatened to be disfellowshipped if they continue to have any kind of communication with me. Something that I had witnessed firsthand from the pulpit where that pastor had disfellowshipped people because they were in communication and even allowed their children to be babysit by a family who had left the church for valid reasons. That also ties into the fear of losing standing because they knew that if they continued dealing with me, that they probably risked having their ministry license taken away, being demoted in the church to where they're just brothers so-and-so sitting on the pew, and they didn't want any of that. So in the eyes of the church, I went from being that loyal, faithful brother to being a threat. I was public enemy number one. In the second part of this episode, I'm going to talk a little bit about the identity collapse. And this is the part that we find ourselves very ill prepared for as survivors. We are not ready for the realization that we now no longer have a role. In my case, I was active in military outreach, military ministry, and I was licensed for over a decade. That was gone. And as a result, my platform was gone. The vocabulary I learned in the church was now a foreign language as I talked to people on the outside. And I was having to learn to reconnect with a world where I had limited access for a very long time. I had an uncertain future ahead because I didn't know what was going to come up next. Yes, there were possibilities, and I was free, but yet at the same time, where do I go? What do I do? Because I was being told what to do for so many years, and to be free to make these choices on my own, it was a foreign concept to me as well. Losing status. Who am I without ministry, without striving? Those are two very important questions that we need to ask ourselves when we find ourselves in a place where we're going to have to leave an abusive, high-performance, high-control ministry. Because at the end of the day, it's not about the titles, it's not about the position you hold or how many people listen to you. It's about who we are one-on-one with our Creator. And that's the part that really matters. Who are we at our core? That's not going to change, even if the circumstances do. And the other question we have to ask ourselves is our beliefs. Do we believe it because we choose it, or do we believe it because it was drilled in our heads? And I have realized that there are some beliefs I still hold on to, some very strong core beliefs, and some that over the course of years I've had to revisit and reevaluate and find out that they were not valid in light of Scripture, in light of what God teaches. At the end of the day it's a matter of, did I choose it or was it drilled in my head? And it was a mix of both. There were some things that were drilled in my head. And those things, eventually, I was able to put those aside. But the ones that I truly chose, it was because I saw the validity in Scripture, and I was able to hold on to it and make that part of my core. Wrapping this particular episode up, it's all about where do we go from here? We find ourselves in a position of leaving, but we don't know where to go next. This is John Cady. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. And if you like this content, again, I ask you to hit like, hit subscribe, and I will catch you on the next one.